Hey folks, welcome back. Today I'm bringing you something that's been a long time coming, which is the updated tier list for Humankind. Today we are going to be talking about the cultures of the ancient era at the very beginning of the game, and we'll be running through each culture one by one, talking about what makes them good, what makes them bad, the advantages and disadvantages, all their emblematic units, quarters, affinities, legacy traits, everything that goes into forming the different cultures across the game. Now, bear in mind that I do pretty much just play single player, and I play on Humankind difficulty, so I am making this tier list with those two items in mind. I'd also like to note that this is really about relative strength, but you can win with any culture in the game and any combination of cultures, even on the hardest difficulty in Humankind. Every culture is feasible in the right set of circumstances. Some are just better than others at helping you get the victory at the end of the game. Now, as far as the cultures, I've timestamped each in the video below, so if you're interested in any particular culture or set of cultures, that should be pretty easy for you to find. So, that being said, let's just get into it, and we're going to be going in alphabetical order. So we'll be starting with the Assyrians. The Assyrians are an expansionist culture, which grants them both a passive and an active ability, as with all affinities. So the passive ability allows for the Assyrians to trespass in enemy territory. Now, normally in the game, you can move through territories that are not attached to a city, regardless of what your affinity is. But if the territory is attached, you are not able to move through those territories unless you're at war or have a particular diplomatic agreement with that empire. The Assyrians, however, can move through those attached territories without any real consequence. Enemies can attack you in those territories without needing to be at war, so, obviously you have to keep an eye out on your units still. But it does have some uses, especially in the early game when it comes to scouting the map. You can find yourself blocked by other empires quite often. So the Assyrians don't have that issue with trying to explore the map since they can just freely move through all the territory. And it has some other benefits when it comes to positioning yourself for early wars or waging a war across a continent if there's, say, another empire that's in your way. The expansionist active ability allows you to move an army onto an administrative center, activate the ability paying a gold cost, and start to annex that territory into your empire. It takes 5 turns, and your army has to stay on that tile for all 5 turns. It's a very easy ability to interrupt because of the number of turns that it takes to activate, and I don't find you get much use out of this. I think it's, kind of a unique one, and you might use it once every few games, but it's hard to actually pull off, and often you'll find it's easier to just go to war rather than using this active ability, but I guess it's kind of nice to have. As far as their legacy trait, Raid Masters is quite valuable, so it gives them +1 land movement speed and +5 combat strength bonus when ransacking. So the combat strength bonus when ransacking is interesting. It combines nicely with their unit, the Assyrian Raiders, that get some extra pillaging when they are ransacking, so you get some extra money by using those units. The combat strength bonus when ransacking will help you ransack faster, basically. So a little bit of bonus and a little bit of synergy with the Assyrian Raiders, but the thing that I really value about the legacy trait is the +1 land movement speed. So this applies to all your units for the entire rest of the game. For a lot of units, this is a 25% increase in the amount of movement that they have. And movement is such a valuable thing to have on all your units. It not only dictates the speed at which you move on the main map, but it also dictates the speed that you move on the battle map. And this opens up a world of possibilities in terms of your ability to use tactical decisions to defeat the AI in combat and kind of on the campaign map, for lack of a better word. It allows you to reposition your armies faster, to fix your own mistakes faster. Say you have mispositioned armies or units when you're in battle. And at the start of the game, it is also an economy boost. And the reason it's an economy boost is because of all the curiosities that are around the map. So because of this legacy trait, the Assyrians actually have a really good, what I call a curiosity economy, because the extra movement speed affords you the ability to pick up more of those curiosities, which can grant you a whole bunch of bonuses at the start of the game. Science, money, influence, units. Like, there's all sorts of things you can get by just exploring the map, and the Assyrians are better at it than most of the other cultures in the ancient era, and those small benefits at the start of the game can add up to larger benefits over time. So the emblematic quarter for the Assyrians is the Dunu. It gives you +3 influence just as a base output. And that's the only thing that it gives you as far as outputs. It does function basically as a garrison in Commons Quarter, but it doesn't give you that +5 base stability that a garrison does. Has some extra district fortification, but the real key for this is that it can be purchased on outposts using influence. So when you have an outpost that is not attached to one of your cities, you can spend some influence to purchase the Dunu, and then the Dunu will start feeding you influence back. And I think it takes something like 11 or 12 turns to make the influence back. But over the long term, the Assyrians are actually quite competent at generating influence. You can also combine the Dunu with the Liberty sort of social axis that gives extra influence on emblematic quarters to really pump up the outputs here. But bear in mind that the Liberty axis only affects emblematic quarters that are in cities. It doesn't affect the Dunu if it's in an unattached territory. So the Assyrians are interesting in that they're quite competent at expanding, maybe not as good as the Esthetes because they can't just click a button to generate influence, but they can kind of slowly build up a lot of that influence over time through the use of the Dunu. And later on, once you start getting some bonuses, it can be pretty nice to have some of these Dunus in your cities to provide some stability that you'll get from, say, social policies and infrastructure and that sort of thing. So finally, the Assyrians' emblematic unit is the Assyrian Raiders, and I've talked a little bit about them already. So they're 21 strength. They're a melee unit, obviously. They're a little bit expensive in terms of production. They're 90 production, and they have a 4-horse resource requirement. They also ignore zone of control, and like I said before, they get some extra money when they're ransacking. So that'll primarily be administrative centers. So the Assyrian Raiders are a really interesting unit. And that plus 10% bonus money when ransacking is going to make, I think, a new player think, oh, I should just, build some of these and try to ransack all my enemies and make a bunch of money. That is only partially true. And I am going to point to the perhaps 2 series ago when I recorded playing the Assyrians about how you should actually use the Assyrian Raiders at the start of the game, which is to bully the absolute hell out of other players that are playing the game. And the way you do that is you basically settle your first city, you get domestication, you build as many Assyrian Raiders as you can, and then you run around and siege enemy cities. So the thing is, right, with the Assyrian Raiders, they unlock with one of the very first techs in the game, and you can get a discount to that technology in the Neolithic era. So you can get the Assyrian Raiders online really, really quickly. And in order to reinforce armies, enemies have to have a tech unlocked that's in like the 3rd tier of technology in the ancient era. So when you show up with Assyrian Raiders at your enemy's door, all they're going to have are some levies and maybe a scout. And you can't assault a city with the Assyrian Raiders. They can't attack across fortifications. You'll find that your enemy, because they're just going to be sieged down by your raiders, they will sally out on the very first turn that is available to them and try to kill you. And your Assyrian Raiders can basically just stand there on some decent terrain and absorb hits and kill your enemies. And you'll start getting free cities. So I'd recommend looking back at my game before to kind of see how to use these. But yeah, they're really good. Fantastic early bullies. Once the game gets a little bit farther and the enemies have larger armies, they start getting archers and warriors and spearmen and the ability to reinforce in combat and that sort of thing. They become quite a bit less effective. But you can get like 3, 4, 5 cities in the first 20 turns of the game, which will put you over your city cap, but you can absolutely cripple your opponent using these. So Assyrians, couple advantages and disadvantages. In my opinion, they are the best very early game bully. No one can out-bully the Assyrians at the start of the game, assuming that you have a even halfway decent start with like a decent balance of food and industry, and probably a couple scouts to disband as well. They also have a really excellent curiosity economy, which is something that you can't underestimate. It is a somewhat marginal benefit compared to the outputs that you get, but especially some of the influence and gold that you can pick up, as well as a few free units, can really help your game. The Assyrians also have super high snowball potential because of that strategy I talked about with the Assyrian Raiders and sieging down enemy cities at the very start of the game. You can win a bunch of early wars acquire several ancient era cities very quickly. And then movement is also extremely valuable. And in the ancient era, it's the only way to get that extra movement. There's some other opportunities later throughout the game, but if you pick the Assyrians, even just that like 5 base movements on some of the units, or like 7 movements on more mobile units, it's really useful, and you'll start to kind of understand the benefits of it as you play with it. Now, a couple disadvantages with the Assyrians is that they are completely dependent on horse access. If you do not have horses, do not pick the Assyrians. They're pretty much useless without horses, because you are giving up the really strongest part of the culture in the early game Assyrian raider rush for pretty limited benefits compared to what you would get from other cultures. And kind of in line with that, right, the Assyrians have really limited direct benefits to generating films. The only thing they really get is that +3 influence on their Dunu, which is a nice benefit, admittedly, right? But they don't have any benefits to science, money, industry, or food. And if you don't take advantage of your really early Assyrian raiders, you will fall behind other cultures quite quickly, because you don't have the ability to scale up your industry or whatever outputs in the same way as some other cultures do without taking their cities from them. So, that being said, where did I put the Assyrians? I have slotted the Assyrians into B tier, so there's no change from the last time that I made this tier list. And I do think this is a pretty appropriate location for them. They are really, really, really good in the right situation. When you have horses, where you have some neighbors, where you have like a decent start with like a good balance of food and industry, and you can snowball really easily. But they are so limited by horse access, and if you screw up your early game in terms of taking the fight to the enemy and trying to annex some cities really early, then they don't really offer you any benefits over any of the other cultures, aside from some extra curiosity pickup ability because of, say, scout extra movement, but again, somewhat marginal. So Assyrians can be really strong, but they can also be really weak, especially if you've picked them in the wrong situation. So Assyrians, I think, are B tier. So let's move on to the next. Next up, we have the Babylonians, who are the scientist affinity. So the scientist affinity allows you to research next era technologies. So when you're in the ancient era, say as the Babylonians, you can research into the classical era. This has various advantages at different points in the game. Going into the early modern, for instance, is one of the really big ones where scientist is important because it allows you to get manufactories an era earlier. In the ancient era, perhaps the most effective use of this particular ability is the swordsman rush. So swordsmen normally unlock at one of the first techs in the classical era, and the Babylonians have the ability to get there quite quickly because of some of the bonuses they get, and obviously because they can research that tech before they actually advance into the classical era. So the affinity offers you some strategic advantages in terms of being able to unlock additional technologies that can give you bonuses to outputs or increase the capabilities of your units before some of the other cultures have access to them. There is a bit of a downside to this particular ability, and that is when you advance into the next age, you are going to be a little bit time constrained. And what I mean by that is when you go into the next era and you pick a different affinity, say you were to pick the Morians or something in the classical era, that means that you've already researched some of the technologies of that era, and because you were a scientist before, you're probably going to have more science output than you would had you picked another culture. So the amount of technologies that you have available to research for the classical era is lower. Now, it means it's easier to reach your science era stars, but sometimes it can mean that you don't have enough time to accumulate your other stars before you're really heavily incentivized to advance to the following era. So this can kind of rear its head a little bit with the Babylonians, as well as some of the other scientist affinities, where it handicaps your fame generation a little bit in the following eras because science doesn't spill over. You're just losing it every turn that you're not researching something. So that is something to keep in mind and something that you have to balance whenever you pick a scientist, Babylonians included. Their active ability with the scientists is they can convert the industry and money in one city into science. I believe it lasts, 5 turns or something like that. But all the industry, all the money in that city is now science output. So it allows you to boost your science temporarily by sacrificing some of your other outputs. You probably won't use it that much in the early game. Having your industry and money is just too important to getting your culture rolling, but it is a nice kind of little strategic benefit that you can get that really allows you to, say, hit a key technology breakpoint or whatever. So if you're doing a swordsman rush, for instance, you might find some cases where this is important, but oftentimes you're not going to use it in the ancient era. So the legacy trait for the Babylonians, I would say, is below average. So you get +2 science per research technology on capital. So at the very, very start of the game, when you have no text research, you will not be getting any science from this. Once you've researched your first technology, you'll get +2 science. So by the end of the ancient era, this is kind of like the equivalent of having 3 researchers maybe in terms of your science output. It's okay. I mean, it mostly helps in the ancient era to snowball your science a little bit. You're not really going to notice the effect of this too much at the end of the game. I mean, you can have 100 science or something, which isn't terrible. I mean, that's a really, really small city in terms of science output, but it's not going to have a major impact most of the time. It just helps get your science rolling a bit at the start of the game. So the real reason that you pick the Babylonians is the emblematic quarter, which is the astronomy house. So it has some benefits to science per the adjacent farmer quarters. It does exploit food and science as well. Gives you a researcher slot, counts as a farmer and a research quarter, so it'll get adjacency bonuses as well as infrastructure bonuses for both of those things. But the real reason that you want the astronomy house is that it gives you +1 food and +1 science per researcher. So normally, say in the ancient era, it's going to be pretty standard to have 2 to 3 attached territories. I try to aim for 3 because there are a lot of valuable emblematic quarters in the ancient era, and particularly with the Babylonians. So if you have the astronomy house in the ancient era, if you have 3 of them, you are increasing the output of your researchers by 50% in terms of their science, and you are adding food to their outputs. So what this allows the Babylonians to do is scale up their research while continuing to effectively grow their population without having to invest too many resources into growth. That's a huge advantage, right? A lot of your outputs at the start of the game are based on your population. So this includes industry, money, and science. All tend to be heavily population-based until later in the game. Industry kind of falls off earlier, but science and money tend to be heavily population-based even until the medieval era. So the astronomy house allows you to continue to accumulate that population that you need in order to fund your wars, for instance, through building units, while also, say, getting to those critical technologies that you want as the Babylonians, like getting swordsmen or whatever else it is that you're interested in. So the astronomy house, really good quarter, scales really well into the late game where you can have a couple powerhouse science cities that will continue to grow just because of the sheer number of researchers that you have that are producing food. So really solid quarter overall. And finally, their emblematic unit, Sabizakesti. It is a spearman replacement with 22 base combat strength. It does have a resource requirement of 5 copper, which is a little unusual for some of the early melee units, but it is what it is. They do have +8 combat strength against mounted units, like all sort of spear and pike units. And they also have an additional +3 CS when they're standing on a friendly district. So very powerful, capable defensive unit, but they are pretty expensive, both in terms of their production and their resource requirement. And the Babylonians don't have any particular benefits to production. So you'll often find with the Sabizakesti that you're not really building them because the next tech in the tree you can get is swordsmen. So it's a little bit redundant to get these because by the time you get to swordsmen, the swordsmen will have higher base combat strength and are the same production to produce. So they're just a little bit redundant in my opinion. If they were for another culture, maybe they would be better, but because of the ability to research into the next era, you're not going to find yourself using these particular units super often. So Disadvantages, advantages for the Babylonians. So they have really good mid and long-term growth in science. The astronomy house really allows you to get a couple like late-game powerhouse, high population, high science cities and make really effective use of the pops that you have, which are going to be a really big contributor to your science output until pretty late in the game. The other kind of advantage that I put here is that you don't have to fight against AI Babylon. And if you've fought against AI Babylon on Humankind difficulty before, you know exactly what I'm talking about, because AI Babylon will have swordsmen on like turn 20 to 25, and it is a bit of a nightmare to fight against. And taking that option away from the AI is, in my eyes, an advantage just because of how important early expansion is. And if the AI are aggressing on you, and, sieging your cities, ruining your outputs, forcing you to invest in units, that's time that's spent not scaling up. So it is an advantage, but kind of an aside from their excellent sort of mid and long-term growth in science. One of the key disadvantages for the Babylonians, though, is that they are really slow to ramp up. So the astronomy house does become available right away, but the nature of Babylonians is that you're incentivized to focus on science pretty early so that you can get to some of the better technologies later in the tree. This kind of means they don't have any real benefits to industry, which is one of the core outputs that you really need in order to start scaling up. And they do have some pop growth, but it isn't as effective as some of the other cultures. And it takes a while to get the astronomy houses online, again, because you don't have particular benefits to industry. So it just takes a while for all the pieces to come together for Babylon. But once they do come together, they're really well positioned later in the game. They also have an expensive and somewhat redundant emblematic unit in the Sabusakesti. If you did not have their emblematic unit, it really wouldn't make a difference to me in terms of when I would pick the Babylonians, just because of their ability to access the swordsmen. So where do I place the Babylonians overall? I place them in B tier, and I do think I talk perhaps a little bit more conservatively about the Babylonians than I do about the Assyrians. However, I think the Babylonians are a bit of the opposite of the Assyrians in a lot of ways, in that the Assyrians are very dependent on your map generation, basically, and your access to horses, right? Their situational dependency is very high, whereas the Babylonians are generally a culture that you can get away with in the vast majority of situations that you're going to encounter in the game. And they don't necessarily excel in any particular situation, but they're going to be a reasonable choice in most of the terrains and situations that you'll find yourself in the game, and you can make it work. Again, they're not going to be the best choice pretty much any time, but just because of how pretty consistent they are and the relative value of the astronomy houses, it just makes them a consistent pick and something you'll often fall back on if some of your primary choices are not available, and it won't feel bad to pick them. So I'm putting Babylon in B tier. Next on the list, we have the Bantu, who are also an expansionist, just like the Assyrians. So we won't run through the abilities again, but it's the same ones that the Assyrians have of being able to trespass and forcibly annexing territories. So going straight into the Bantu's legacy trait of harmonious amalgamation, this gives them +2 influence per number of adjacent empires on territory. So if you have one territory with one adjacent empire to that territory will get +2 influence. If there are two adjacent empires, there will be +4 influence. And that's for every territory that you own. So this can depend a lot on the kind of game that you have, how much influence you'll actually generate from this legacy trait. And this legacy trait is a little bit odd to me. The Bantu have a bit of a design tension in my mind that we'll talk about kind of as we go through the rest of their abilities. And I do find the Bantu a little bit difficult to talk about in isolation of each of their legacy trait, their emblematic unit, and their emblematic quarter, rather than as a culture as a whole, because they're all supposed to kind of work together quite seamlessly in a very specific way. So the emblematic quarter is the Mupia Fields. You get these +10 food on adjacent cities. It replaces an outpost. So the Mupia Fields, you plop it down, and every city that is adjacent to this outpost is going to receive plus 10 food. This one's an interesting one. This actually enables a lot of growth right at the start of the game, which is really valuable. You can have very high food output cities from the moment you enter the Ancient Era, depending on how successful your Neolithic era was. One of the disadvantages here, though, is as soon as you annex that territory into a city, you're going to lose that plus 10 food. And when you advance to the Classical era, right? Because the Mupia fields, all the outpost special quarters are actually replaced with regular outposts once you change your culture. So this isn't retained, and you can often find yourself in a situation where cities that were supported by the Mupia fields are now losing population because they no longer have access to the food that your emblematic quarter was providing. Now, these are interesting because they can support multiple cities, so you can theoretically configure your game in a way that you're getting these benefits across multiple cities, which can be quite strong. And I actually think the Mupia Fields is the best part of the Bantu because you don't really have to invest any additional resources in order to get extra benefits, right? You want to be placing down a whole bunch of outposts at the start of the game anyway in order to claim good territories. But what makes the Bantu interesting are the Burgundy Pioneers. They are what they call a pioneer unit, which allows them to collect basically food that's around the map to create new units. They take 40 food instead of the 20 in the Neolithic era. It does take longer to get them going. You can also buy them from the Mupia fields. They cost 30 influence to purchase one. And what you can use them for is once you have a full army of them, which is 4 of the Burgundy Pioneers, you can then place down an outpost by sacrificing that army of pioneers instead of paying your influence cost. So the idea is you have several of these running around the map, collecting curiosities, that multiplying through food and killing whatever mammoths or deer or whatever are left on the map, and then you can kind of get outposts for free, so to speak, rather than paying an influence cost. This is kind of taking it all together. The Bantu are a little interesting, right? Because the legacy trait kind of incentivizes you to be close to other empires because you want the influence generation. But the Mupia Fields and the Burgundy Pioneers actually incentivize you to pick the Bantu when you are far away from other empires because you want a lot of space to expand into. And one of the things with the Burgundy Pioneers is that the food stops spawning in territories that have been claimed. So once you have claimed that territory for yourself, or once an opposing empire has claimed a territory, that lessens the ability of your Burgundy Pioneers to pick up those food and continue to generate additional pioneers in order to settle outposts. What I found, generally speaking, whenever I've played the Bantu, is that I will use food kind of near the start of the era to supplement whatever pioneers I enter the era with. So the pioneers replace the tribes that you get in the Neolithic era. So once you pick the Bantu, they all become Burgundy Pioneers, and I'll use the food to fill those out, but it's very rare that I'll actually influence purchase additional ones because I've generally just found it more effective to have a warrior that I've picked up through a curiosity that puts down some extra outposts for me for an influence cost. The thing with the food is that it makes it really random how effective you actually are in generating more of these pioneers for free. And I'm using air quotes, and I know you can't see them watching the video, because bear in mind, it's not really for free, right? The trade-off is that you didn't pick another culture. And kind of going into the benefits and disadvantages here, the Bantu, and I'm starting with the negatives, but the Bantu have an issue where there are other cultures that are more effective at what they're supposed to do. So the aesthetes in particular, all 3 of them, I think are just so good at generating influence for a variety of reasons, primarily related to the aesthetes' active ability in the Ancient Era that just allows them to claim more territories just more efficiently. And that is supposed to be what the Bantu are really good at, but in my mind kind of fall short of. Returning to the advantages, and then we'll come back. there is a really high territory snowball potential in certain games. So if you enter the ancient era and you have a lot of the tribes and they become the Burgundy pioneers, you can really quickly get a lot of territories, which really quickly translates into a lot of food as well, right? Because of the Mupia fields. So there's this really fast early growth potential from the Bantu. And, I've had games of the Bantu where you have like 8 population on turn, 17 or whatever it is. Which is a really good way to start the game, right? The pops in the early game are really efficient at generating some of the outputs that you need in order to start your snowball. But they don't have any particularly good benefits to any other aspects of their game. So although you have a lot of pop, like you don't have more efficient quarters to build, for instance. So, you're not playing the Egyptians and you don't have access to the Egyptian pyramids, right? You're just building like the baseline quarters. And you're also disincentivized from attaching outposts because those outposts are feeding your city food. So you're a little bit more territory constrained unless you're willing to make the trade-off of sacrificing that free food, which is worth it sometimes. It just depends kind of on your starting situations. I do find the Bantu have pretty limited long-term benefits. Obviously, the Mupia fields disappear. The Burgundy pioneers, like you need to take advantage of them early to get a lot of outposts settled. The legacy trait harmonious amalgamation is strictly inferior to the Olmecs, really. Maybe not strictly, but in any reasonable game, it's going to be worse than the Olmecs legacy trait, and it just isn't that impactful. And like I said, there's a bit of a design tension there with the way the legacy trait works, which versus like how the Bantu are kind of designed to be played. The other kind of major disadvantage, since a lot of the Bantu play kind of centers around these Burgundy pioneers, is that their emblematic unit growth is really slow, partly just because it's kind of dependent on luck where your food is going to spawn, and your ability to generate more of those pioneers for free by picking up the food is going to slow down as the era progresses and more territory is claimed. So you can start, influence purchasing the pioneers. You can also hard build the pioneers in the city. So in these cases, you're effectively converting industry into influence. But there's a reason that using influence to purchase things is so good, right? Which is that, especially at the start of the game, what you queue up in your city really, really matters. And you're trying to get that city as productive as you can, as early as you can. And building Burgundy pioneers is going to limit your ability to do that. So I generally don't think super highly of this particular culture. There are some cases in which they are okay to pick, but I find I've never really been happy to pick them, like looking back at the ancient era and thinking, oh, I think I probably would have had a better game picking a different culture. And for that reason, I've put them in the C tier. It's not that they're useless or like really, really bad. It's just that in every situation I found myself in, and the situations that, I've thought about picking the Bantu versus another culture, there's usually another culture that wins out. I think the Bantu become an option in very particular situations where some other cultures have already been picked, where you're able to expand into a pretty big amount of territory. This is going to be more likely on Pangaea. And maybe you have like a neighbor on one side of you that you can put some outposts along to generate some influence and then expand in the other direction. But it ends up being a pretty specific set of situations in which the Bantu really excel. And for that reason, I'm putting them in C tier, and largely because of the Mupia Fields growth is very valuable. They just kind of have trouble sustaining some of that momentum throughout both the ancient era as well as later into the game. So they're a bit tricky to really play. So next on the list, we have the Caralans, who are a builder culture, and the builders get 10 temporary stability when they complete a district. So this is pretty handy, especially when you are first entering an era and you kind of want to go on a building spree and you don't have to worry about stability quite as much. You do have to be a little careful, especially once you advance in age and select a non-builder culture. it's pretty easy to lose track of just how much stability you're actually getting from this particular passive, and your stability can end up collapsing a little bit later into the game, even like 10 turns later, right? So don't like rely on this too much unless you're playing builders like the entire game, and then you can almost permanently sustain your stability this way, but just be a little bit careful with it. The active ability allows the Caralans or any builder affinity culture to set a city to land raiser mode. So this is just like the scientist ability, except it converts money and science into industry. So it can be helpful for getting a city online or like really pushing to get a bunch of stuff out really quickly, but just have to be aware that you're sacrificing some kind of global outputs, which are money and science, in order to get industry in one very specific city. So it does have its uses. You're unlikely to use it in the early game because both your science and your money are kind of hard to come by when you have very few cities and low outputs, but there are some cases in which you might use it. The Caralans' legacy trait, cooperative spirit, is generally the reason you're looking to pick the Caralans. In fact, it's probably the only reason. So cooperative spirit gives +1 food, industry, money, or science on the respective quarters per adjacent quarter of the same type. So if you have a maker's quarter and another maker's quarter adjacent to it, each maker's quarter is going to get +1 industry. If you have 3 maker's quarters and a triangle, each of those maker's quarters is going to get +2 industry. So having 3 maker's quarters with the Caralans is going to give you a total of +6 industry over other cultures, or at least most other cultures that don't have like direct FIMS benefits, right? And this is true of all of their quarters. So cooperative spirit is actually a very good legacy trait that scales really well later into the game. It doesn't give you very much benefit right at the start of the game because you have too few quarters for this to really make a meaningful difference. But when you're late in the game, right, you will have dozens and dozens and dozens of quarters, and often you're going to be specializing areas to all be of the same type of quarter, so you'll be getting a lot of this benefits later into the game. The Caralans' emblematic quarter, the ceremonial plaza, gives you +2 faith per adjacent district, which is a nice little bonus. It does exploit all FIMS, which includes adjacent coastal water and lake tiles. So ceremonial plaza can be nice in situations where there are a lot of there's a big variety of FIMS, specifically food and industry, that you want to capture, because ceremonial plaza does not require being connected to a main plaza or administrative center. So it's similar to a hamlet in that way, but it does have the restriction that it needs to be placed next to either coastal water or a lake. So you are quite a bit more limited. In cases where perhaps you are landlocked or you have limited coastal water or the tiles by the coastal water aren't very good, the ceremonial plaza loses a lot of value. And I found in my games that it's quite frequent that the ceremonial plaza loses a lot of value. It's not very often where I think, yes, I need to capture the outputs that are along the coast. Oftentimes, the more efficient outputs are in other parts of the territory. That's not always true, right? But it does kind of limit the usefulness of the ceremonial plaza. And because the ceremonial plaza doesn't count as any specific type of the quarters that the legacy trait benefits from, building the ceremonial plaza doesn't help you scale up quite as much as some of the other quarters can, even though it does help you generate a large variety of the outputs. And finally, the emblematic unit, the healers, I think are potentially one of the worst emblematic units in the era. I mean, they have 16 combat strength, so it's less than a warrior. Kind of normal stuff. Pretty low production of 45 production, which is nice, same as a warrior. And they provide health regeneration when the army is kind of outside friendly territories to all units in the army. The kind of problem I have with healers is multifold, really. The first is that they have lower combat strength than just baseline units. So remember, they're occupying an army slot that I could have occupied with warriors, for instance, right, which have a higher combat strength. So if I am using warriors instead of healers, I will take less damage in combat because they have a higher strength. So the health regen has to make up for the extra damage I'm going to take since I have a lower baseline strength. And having a lower baseline strength also means that not only will this particular unit take more damage, but because it's not as effective as a blocker unit as a warrior, and obviously isn't ranged, it means your other units will take more damage as well, because you need to move the healers around to stop them from dying before you would need to move around your warriors. So the other part of the problem I have with this is a lot of the times in the Ancient Era, if you need to heal, you can just put down an outpost if you're in neutral territory and spend your time healing there, or you can immediately purchase up your health with some gold. So the healers are a little constrained to being in enemy territory, but even then, the times you're in enemy territory, you're often just going to be sieging a city, and as soon as you take the city, you can heal your units anyway. So I just think the healers are a little bit too niche to really provide any significant impact in the Ancient Era. And I personally don't build them as the Caralans because I don't really see the value in building them. So one main advantage to the Caralans, which is they have really high late game potential because of the legacy trait. You are going to build so many districts throughout the game. They have a lot of problems though. So they have very few impactful early bonuses. Cooperative Spirit takes quite a while to scale up. Ceremonial Plaza can be good in some situations, but I found, when I play the Caralans, I am much more limited by the placement restriction of the Ceremonial Plaza than it feels like I should be in a lot of ways, and I just don't generate the type of outputs that I would hope to generate from the Ceremonial Plaza just because of that placement restriction. There's obviously, I've talked about the limited emblematic quarter placement. I've talked about the bad emblematic unit, but because it takes the Caralans quite a while to scale up, I find that they can have somewhat limited Era Star potential as well. So, once you get to around turn 50, 40 to 50 is when you, or at least when I'm typically looking to enter the classical era. And I think the Caralans have a lot of trouble getting to the points where they are satisfied with the amount of Era Stars that they've gotten just because of the time that it takes them to scale to a point that they're pretty effective. And I think overall with the Caralans, I think you all might see a little bit where this is going. But the problem I have with the Caralans is that there's pretty much never a situation where I feel like the Caralans are the best pick. There are only situations where I feel safe to pick them, and even in those situations they might not be my number one or even number two option. And that's not to say that they can't have a high late game potential, but you have to survive the early game, and their early growth and industry output and all that kind of stuff is a lot more limited than a lot of the other cultures that are available. They don't really give you much that impacts your early game in a really meaningful way. So I am putting them in C tier. I'm not putting them in D tier simply because of the strength of their legacy traits, but you do have to get past the early game with them, and it's not like it's impossible to do, right? Obviously, Humankind AI is what Humankind AI is, but the actual advantages that they're conveying to you in the Ancient Era are just not that strong. It's just that the advantage they convey to you over the long run can be very good, even better than some of the other cultures that are available to you. It's just that the strength of early growth and early bonuses are often a lot better than bonuses that scale up through the course of the game because it allows you to snowball more quickly. Next on the list, we have the Egyptians, who are another builder culture. We just covered builders, so we'll just gloss over that for now. But as a reminder, 10 temporary stability when completing a district, and you can convert money and science to industry in one of your cities. The legacy trait for the Egyptian is called Grand Planners. They give +1 industry on tile producing industry, so this includes both exploitations as well as districts. So anything that produces industry is going to get a +1 bonus. You also get a -10% district industry cost, so it's cheaper to actually build districts. And this is another legacy trait that's really, really good. It doesn't scale quite as well as the Caralans, but the immediate bonus that you get from it is very strong. Grand Planners is a legacy trait that can increase your production by like 50 to 100% at the very start of the game, which in my opinion is significantly more impactful than a slowly scaling bonus. And the additional district industry reduction cost, the minus 10% on district industry cost, is something that also scales very well throughout the game and effectively kind of mimics the industry bonus, at least, that the Caralans get, because it allows you to produce districts more cheaply the later the game goes. And this applies across all your districts. So the legacy trait, quite strong. Increased industry and reduced district industry cost combines really well with the pyramids, if you can actually get the pyramids as the Egyptians. Not their emblematic quarter, which we'll talk about in a minute, but the wonder of the pyramids reduces the district industry cost by 25% as well. Big fan of Grand Planners, really allows you to build a ton of districts right at the start of the game. The extra industry can support the production of infrastructure, of units, whatever it is that you need. So great legacy trait. We have the emblematic quarter, the Egyptian pyramid. So the Egyptian pyramid does give +3 industry, just flat out, an additional +2 industry per adjacent maker's quarter, a base +1 influence, and exploits industry. So it's basically a souped up maker's quarter. And the maker's quarter is the thing that you're going to be building in the ancient era. Some cultures accept it, of course, but industry is always going to be relevant in every single game that you play. You're always going to have maker's quarters in every single city that you own. So the Egyptian pyramid just being an improvement to the maker's quarter makes it itself a really good quarter. Like the maker's quarter by itself is already worth building pretty much all the time. So the extra industry that you get, the extra influence that you get, even though it's pretty marginal, combined with the legacy trait, makes for a really, really strong production game for the Egyptians. And then the emblematic unit, the Markabata, is an interesting one. It has 24 strength, a ton of movement, 3 range. It is very expensive, 180 production, 8 horses, and 5 copper. And it can be difficult to come across that many resources early in the game. If you have access to at least 1 horse and 1 copper, you can build it, but it's going to be at a pretty significant production cost. So the production cost is going to increase if you don't meet all the resource requirements. The Markabata can move after making an attack, which makes it a hyper-mobile, annoying skirmish unit. It does have -8 CS when defending against attacks in melee, but it does have a pretty high base combat strength. So it's quite a bit more resilient than a lot of other ranged units. It's also a direct fire unit, so unlike archers, it can't shoot over other units. It has to have direct line of sight, like a javelin or a crossbow or something like that, which does limit its utility a little bit, but because it has such high movements, you can usually kind of get over it. There are some terrain constraints on this, of course, that make archers better in some situations, but still a pretty strong unit. It does have some issues in that it comes in pretty late in the era. The Markabata used to be like the uncontested king of the ancient era in a lot of ways, but there have been some nerfs to it, particularly making it a direct fire unit, and pretty high resource requirements have made it a little bit less dominant than it was. There are some advantages to the Markabata in that it can be relevant into the next era as well, because archers don't get an upgrade in the classical era. So having a higher base combat strength ranged unit can make your fire support a lot more effective into the following era. So there are some advantages and disadvantages. Just know that you'll get them a little bit late into the era. So big advantage of the Egyptians, they have really high mid and late game potential because of their legacy trait, +1 industry on tile, producing industry. Both scales pretty well because you're getting extra industry on every single additional tile, but also because you have such high industry at the start of the game, you have more industry later in the game to get even more industry, if that makes sense. You also have a pretty good emblematic unit. It's not the best of the era, but once you have access to it, the Markabata can be a bit of a menace. Especially with such a high base combat strength, you can really tear apart the AI using the Markabata. They also have an excellent legacy trait, both +1 industry on tile and -10 district industry cost. Honestly, like the legacy trait would be worth picking the Egyptians for alone in a lot of situations. The Egyptian pyramid and the Markabata are like nice add-ons, but the legacy trait by itself is really strong. And then the bonuses are really just effective all game, right? Like the Egyptian pyramid is nice, like it's a maker's quarter. You're going to continue to get benefits to maker's quarters throughout the game. The legacy trait is going to benefit you throughout the game. The emblematic unit, most emblematic units are pretty much just effective for a limited period of time, but even like the Markabata is effective for a longer period of time than a lot of other emblematic units. So overall, like the Egyptians have like a really long time frame on which they're effective that some other cultures can't really say. Now, they do have some problems. So the Egyptians do have a slow start due to limited population and influence growth. And these two things are tied together, right? So population generates influence. You have +2 influence per pop when you have a stable city, when it's above 90%, and you get +1 influence per pop when you're between, it's like 30 and 90%. So having limited population growth because you don't have any food generation both inhibits your ability to generate money and science, and your ability to generate influence, which means the Egyptians can be slightly slower to expand their territory, since that requires pretty decent influence generation, and have lower capability to support things like building an army or investing pops into science or money. So there are a couple era stars that can be hard for them. Money in particular I've found to be pretty difficult, and influence in particular I found to be pretty difficult. Science you can kind of make up for because you don't really need pops on industry, you can move them to science, but your cities are going to be lower population overall than a lot of the other options that are available, and that can be pretty important in some contexts in the early game. You also have a pretty late and expensive emblematic unit. So we talked about this a little bit already, but the Markabata can come too late into the era sometimes to really take advantage of it, but it can still be effective into the next era. And finally, the emblematic unit has a really, really bad upgrade path. So you will invest into these Markabatas, but the next generic upgrade that they have is actually the Dragoon in the industrial era. So unless you have one of 3 culture picks over the classical and the medieval, then there's nothing to upgrade the Markabata into. I believe it's like the Garamantes, the Morians, or maybe it's not the Morians, and the Bulgarians, but it's like they only upgrade into other emblematic units. So once you build them, you're kind of stuck with them for a long period of time, unless you happen to be in a situation where you need a very specific other culture. So where do I put the Egyptians overall? I have put them into A tier. In my previous tier list, I put them in S tier. They are still very good. The nature of the game has changed a little bit, and in particular, some changes to other culture types have influenced where the Egyptians are. But overall, they are very strong, and oftentimes can be, I wouldn't say oftentimes, but sometimes can be like the most viable choice for certain situations. So think a case where you have started on a desert, right? There's not really anyone else that can take big advantage of that. But because of the Egyptians +1 industry per tile, they can kind of overcome that disadvantage of not having a ton of food generation by working a bunch of tiles very quickly. So the Egyptians, great culture, industry is relevant all game long, allows you to amp up your other outputs. They scale pretty well late into the era. And, if you've played the Egyptians before at a pretty high level, you know how big your cities can get very fast with them. So Egyptians, really solid pick in almost every situation. So putting them in A tier. So next we have the Harappans, who are our first agrarian affinity. And the agrarians get 5 temporary stability when gaining population. This is kind of equivalent to the builder's ability. I would say overall less impactful, especially as the game goes on. Early on, it can give you some extra stability, but the thing is, early on, you don't have enough quarters that you're really struggling with stability anyway. So it's not quite as effective as you might hope. They do have the active ability of attracting one population from each adjacent territory for an influence cost. This does include your own territory, so you can steal your own pops away from other territories. This also includes enemy territories, though, right? So ideally, you're largely taking pops from your enemies. This does give them a grievance against you, so do watch out for that. I find I don't generally use this ability just because influence is so valuable early in the game. I don't find the trade-off of influence for centralizing population in one of my city to be worth it a lot of the time. But there are some times when you might use it, and bear in mind that pops do generate influence, especially when you have high stability, right? So 90 plus stability, you have plus 2 influence. So in some cases, it can definitely be worth it. The legacy trait for the Harappans is quite good. It's not what it used to be, but you do get +1 food on river and +1 food on dry grass. I will note that these don't seem to stack with each other, so you can have river running through a dry grass tile, and you will still get +1 food. So the Harappans, as soon as you settle a territory, you will get a pretty big boost to your food, which is super, super important early in the game because several of your outputs are completely dependent or partly dependent on your population. So your influence generation, which is one of the most important resources at the start of the game, is highly dependent on population, as I just talked about a moment ago. Your science and money are almost entirely dependent on your population at the start of the game through the specialist slots, and your industry is partly dependent because of your worker slots that you have available. So scaling up food is very valuable at the start of the game, and the Harappans do it very well. And playing into that theme, they have the canal network. So the canal network is a souped up farmer's quarter, basically. So you get +3 food base, you get extra food per adjacent farmer's quarter, and you exploit food just like a farmer's quarter does. And importantly, it counts as a river. So what makes the canal network really unique here is that it not only benefits from infrastructure that benefit farmers' quarters, but it also gets benefits from infrastructure that benefit rivers. So rivers, once you get all the infrastructure, get you an extra +4 food, as well as an extra +2 industry. So the canal network is actually a very efficient quarter that scales up really well over the course of the game. And because of the Harappans legacy trait, where you're getting extra food, so you want to exploit that, and the extra base food on the canal network, it makes it quite effective to actually build it at the start of the game as well. In a way that it isn't so much with some other cultures. So like the Babylonians, for instance, although their quarter exploits food, because they don't have the same amount of benefits to food, it isn't nearly as effective in terms of enabling population growth as the canal network is. Finally, we have the emblematic unit, which are the runners. So the runners are a scout replacement, and I believe they have 1 extra movement over the scout, don't quote me on that, and they have no movement penalties from forest and 14 combat strength. They are slightly stronger than a scout, so you can bully enemies pretty early with these guys, especially if they are still in the Neolithic era. I have had a couple games where I've captured cities with runners, if you have enough of them at the start and can siege them down right away, just because they have somewhat higher combat strength. So there also are some opportunities there. But the thing I would focus on with the runners is that it enables a better exploration of your environment. So, you can find other people earlier, you can get trade agreements, where you want to settle outposts, those sorts of things. But also, like I talked about with the Assyrians, the Harappans have a good curiosity economy because the runners are more efficient in their movement, particularly with not having any movement penalties from forest. So the runners enable you to get extra money, influence, science, units, those sorts of things, on top of the things that are being produced in your cities. So the runners are really an economic unit in a lot of ways, rather than a combat unit, which makes them fill a bit of a unique role compared to a lot of the other emblematic units of the era. So I do like the runners. Obviously, they're not as effective as, say, having a combat-oriented unit when it comes to the Harappans' combat abilities. But because the Harappans have so much food, you'll find that the Harappans are actually a very dangerous opponent because of the sheer quantity of units that they can field, whereas some other cultures struggle to maintain that amount of military simply because they don't have the growth to sustain it. So the Harappans are like really the ideal culture to have the runners instead of like a really combat-oriented unit. So overall, Harappans, what do I think? they have really fast starts on all outputs. It looks like it's just food, right? But remember, a lot of your outputs at the start of the game are population dependent, so the Harappans are really good at scaling that up very quickly. They also have really high mid to late game potential, largely because of the legacy trait. It's not as high as the Egyptians or the Caralans. It's not quite that good because districts become more important than population late in the game, but population is still quite impactful. They also have an excellent curiosity economy because of the runners, and they have very high Aerostar potential because of your ability to generate population. The main drawback to the Harappans is that they require rivers to be effective, but generally there is a sufficient quantity of rivers in your games that you're not really going to notice whether or not that is going to be a drawback for you, right? So like most games, you can pretty much blind pick them and it's not going to be an issue. It's just every once in a while there might not be like sufficient river or dry grass to really get a huge benefit from the Harappans. And you'll look at this and think like, wow, there are barely any drawbacks. And yeah, I mean, the Harappans are a great culture. They're probably my most played just because of how consistent and how strong they are. They used to be even better back when the legacy trait was the +1 food on river and +1 food on exploitation. They were pretty insane. And they're still very good, not as good as they used to be. And honestly, like the main drawback with the Harappans is just that there have been some changes in the game that have made a couple other cultures like a little bit stronger, in my opinion. But the Harappans are a very consistent, good choice, and for that reason, I've put them in the A tier. I don't think that'll surprise too many people. Obviously, I had put them in the S tier before, and I think they belonged there, and I think they belong in the A tier now. If you want, like, kind of the vanilla kind of Humankind experience from the ancient era, I think the Harappans are, like, the best culture to pick for that. They're so just consistent, in my opinion, and you can do a lot of things well. You can generate a lot of Aerostars, and you can kind of pivot in any direction that you want, having picked the Harappans, in a way that isn't quite as easy with some of the other culture picks. So the Harappans, great early game, great throughout the game. Really like the Harappans, solid A tier. I do think some people might ask the question, why are the Harappans in A tier while the Bantu are in C tier? Because in practice, at least in the ancient era, they actually end up having very similar effects, right? Because they're both providing a ton of food, which enables you to produce a lot of other outputs. I mentioned before that the Bantu have a bit of a kind of design tension that I don't think that the Harappans have to the same extent. Really, the Harappans don't have any design tension. Everything they have works very well together, whereas I don't think that's quite true with the Bantu. And I think the Bantu suffer from this problem where you don't always know what you're going to get when you pick them because of the way the Bagendi pioneers work. You have to get those food spawns in territories to like make efficient use of them. And it's not that you can't build those Bagendi pioneers in other ways. So you can influence purchase them or you can make them with production. But when it comes to the Harappans, you're just using kind of your standard influence strategy to place your outposts down. And because you have so much population, you can do that very consistently, especially if you're taking the right social policies. And then once you advance an era, it's like you had never played the Bantu to begin with. There aren't any really long-lasting, impactful abilities from the Bantu, whereas the Harappans' emblematic quarter will stay with you throughout the game and scale up with you as you get the various infrastructure that affect them. And the legacy trait never really deteriorates in value and kind of gets better in a way as you start building more quarters that are going to exploit food. So I do think just the Harappans are much more consistent than the Bantu, and you can pick them virtually all the time, whereas the Bantu are in a situation where they're a little bit more constrained in terms of when it is feasible to pick them, and the outcome of picking the Bantu is not as controllable, right? You don't always know how well you're going to do because of how the Bagendi pioneers grow. And there are ways around that, but the Harappans are just much more consistent and effective in terms of generating those early game outputs that you need to win the game. Next up, we have the Hittites, who are a militarist affinity, and militarists get a passive ability of plus 30 war support equilibrium value. So basically, most cultures in the game, you have a baseline war support of 50 before you consider any other effects like cultural proximity. When it comes to the militarists, though, you have a baseline of 80, and that's before you have things like grievances, right? So it makes it much easier for militarists to go to war, especially after generating some grievances. But even like surprise wars or whatever, you're going to have a very high war support at the start, which also makes it easier to claim territories at the end of the war. Their active ability allows them to raise a militia army in a city, which costs population. So this militia army is based on whatever your sort of garrison technology is. So whether it's like citizens or levies or what have you, that's going to be the army that gets raised. They're not particularly effective units. There are some fun things that you can do with them, particularly later in the game as like the Germans. But like in this case, like might need an emergency army maybe, but as a militarist, you should probably have a decent sized military anyway, and you want to be going out and conquering other cities. Militia army, I mean, you can move population between cities by disbanding, but like it has kind of an edge use. It's not as valuable as the passive ability. As far as the legacy trait, the Lust for War, it gives +1 combat strength on unit, and this is actually quite a strong capability. So the +1 combat strength on unit, remember that the damage that a unit does to another unit is based on the difference in combat strength, just like the raw difference and not the proportional difference, right? So a military unit that has 73 combat strength versus a unit that has 72 combat strength does the same amount of damage as a unit with 20 combat strength against a unit with 19 combat strength. So in effect, what this means is this +1 combat strength is as useful as it is when you pick it throughout the entire game. You are always going to have that marginal benefit over your enemies in combat because of this legacy trait. It's actually quite strong, and I like it quite a bit. But they've also kind of acquired this additional component of their legacy trait where they get +20 food, industry, money, and science on every city that they own per city that the Hittites occupy. So if you have one city, you have gone to war, you are currently occupying another city that you haven't annexed at the end of the war, you are getting +20 of each of these outputs on your one city. If you have two cities, you are getting +20 of each of these outputs on both of your cities. If you have two cities and have occupied two cities, you are getting +40 of these outputs on each of the cities that you own. It is actually pretty crazy. You can get some really good scaling effects from this legacy trait, especially if you are engaged in a lot of wars. And because Humankind no longer requires you to like immediately end the war once your opponent hits 0 war support, it means you can like drag out the end of the war in order to supplement your core city's ability to produce these outputs and help them scale up, which is needed because the Hittites don't have a great emblematic quarter. They have the Awari, which is a outpost replacement. All it does is basically provide +3 money. It gives some health regen for units in a territory, which can be nice in some circumstances, and it acts as a land spawn for neighboring cities. So I can kind of use this to forward deploy my units so I can be extra warmongery and get my units to the front more quickly. So the Awari basically supports really aggressive play towards your enemies. And then the emblematic units, the Gigir, I'm not really sure what the pronunciation is of the G when it comes to the Hittites, but it is a chariot replacement, 23 base combat strength, high movement, quite expensive, 180 production, high resource requirements, the horses and copper. That actually may be a typo. I think it's 8 horses rather than 6. Attacked units can't move the next turn when the Gigir attacks them. So this is the suppression effect, and quite strong for keeping units in place. They also have +3 combat strength when attacking enemies that are not adjacent to them at the beginning of their turn. So if they move to a different square and then attack a unit, they'll get that charge bonus. And then importantly, like all mounted units, they can't climb over fortifications, so you can't attack into cities unless you've destroyed the fortifications somehow. They are quite a good, strong unit. I would say that in general, it can be difficult to use them because they come so late in the era. And I wouldn't say they're particularly effective into the next era once swordsmen and some other emblematic units are on the scene. They used to struggle more because the Hittites didn't have any real advantages to any outputs. Now, because you can kind of occupy cities to generate extra FIMs, acquiring this emblematic unit before you basically get to the end of the era is a lot more feasible. And actually being able to produce it is a lot more feasible, but it requires you to have kind of already gone to war and won, or effectively won. So kind of the use case for this is like you've already won one war and now you're going into another war. It's a difficult cadence to maintain. So it is a good unit if you can get to it somewhat early because you're like going full warmonger. But oftentimes it's going to be pretty late in the era that you get access to this and not particularly impactful. I think the +1 combat strength is better than the emblematic unit just using baseline like warriors and archers. So what are the kind of advantages and disadvantages here? Hittites have really high snowball potential because of the updates to their legacy traits with the +20 of each output on each own city per occupied city. So once you have effectively won a war or started occupying cities, your outputs increase really, really dramatically. And it even like scales into the late game, right? Like late game, you can be occupying 4 cities at a time and you yourself have 9 cities, right? Like that's a ton of outputs per city. That's 80 of each of those outputs per city that you own in that situation. They also, like I said, have a good legacy trait. The +1 combat strength on unit is relevant all game. The extra FIMs is relevant all game, even if it's more situational, right? You're not getting those FIMs all the time. I think the issue with the Hittites, though, is that it's really difficult to catch up if you've fallen behind at any point, which is pretty easy to do because they don't actually have any direct benefits to their FIMs outputs. So you're just, when you settle with the Hittites, right, you just have whatever outputs you have in the place that you've settled, and you kind of have to make do with that. You don't have any particular benefits to growth or to industry. So it makes their snowball kind of difficult to achieve as well. Like if you don't have the military to take out an opponent pretty early or to start occupying their cities, then you're kind of SOL. Like the opponents are going to scale up much more quickly than you are. So the Hittites are kind of about rushing someone down very quickly in order to get their snowball going, but they don't have any advantages to getting your initial snowball going. If you can manage to capture an enemy city very, very quickly early in the game, you can reach that snowball potential where you become kind of unstoppable because the extra outputs on your city, like you can get more in 5 turns than some people will produce in like 20 turns, right? Just on their core cities. But it can be difficult to reach that point because there aren't any benefits to getting there. They also have a really late and expensive emblematic unit in the gig year. It's a good unit. It's just because of where it is in the tech tree, it can be difficult to make effective use of. So overall, I think the Hittites have improved, specifically because of the legacy trait, but they are a gamble to pick because you need to hit a point that you are easily able to take an enemy city early in the game. So if you are confident that you can do that, go ahead and pick the Hittites. You can snowball pretty effectively by occupying enemy cities for an extended period of time. But it's a risk, right? It's a gamble in a way that a lot of other cultures are not, who are going to provide you very, very consistent outputs and very consistent results based on the units and outputs and effects that they provide. So overall, I put Hittites in C tier. They can definitely outperform C tier, as can other ones here. It's just that they're not as consistent in doing so and don't always give you the tools that you're going to need in order to perform in a wide array of situations. This brings us to our second militarist for the era, which is the Mycenaeans. And like I just said, they're militarists, so I'm not going to bother covering the same affinity again, but they get the legacy trait Brutal Upbringing, which is minus 20% unit industry cost and plus 25 experience on creating units. The second part of this effectively means that all the units the Mycenaeans create are going to start with one level of veterancy, which is plus 1 combat strength. So in effect, at the start of the game, this is basically the same thing as the Hittites legacy trait, except that you get this extra unit industry cost reduction, which is really, really critical because it allows you to produce your units more effectively as a militarist that is looking to attack other people and take them over, right? It saves you multiple critical turns at the start of the game and saves you production that you can then reinvest into something else, either quarters or more units or whatever it is that you like. This is a really great trait, and the minus 20% unit industry cost in particular scales really well later into the game as units get more and more expensive. Having this cost reduction can have a big impact on your ability to create and sustain your military as the game goes on. This brings us to the emblematic quarter, which is the Cyclopean Fortress. I am a big fan of the Cyclopean Fortress, so it exploits industry. That's the only benefit that it has for outputs, right? So you get plus 2 combat strength for units in or adjacent to the district. It gets you plus 5 stability. You get some district fortification. It does count as a maker's quarter and a garrison, and it increases movement cost of hostile armies within one tile. So let's break down why this is important. And I actually couldn't fit this in the effects here, but the Cyclopean Fortress you can place anywhere in the territory. And that's why it's so valuable. You can choose the highest industry exploitation you possibly can find within your entire territory and place the Cyclopean Fortress there. This is much more efficient than just building an individual maker's quarter because the number of tiles you are exploiting is actually greater. So the maker's quarter has to be adjacent to your administrative or city center. And that means that it is kind of double exploiting something the several tiles that the city center is already exploiting. Whereas the Cyclopean Fortress can exploit all tiles around it that are not being currently exploited. So this makes it very valuable in terms of early industry production. So because it's a garrison, it does serve as a unit spawn point as well, so you can have some opportunities to spawn units a little bit closer. But the other important effect here is this plus 5 stability and counting as a garrison. So the Cyclopean Fortress, because it counts as a garrison and gives a little bit of stability, it actually scales really well later into the game for when stability starts becoming an issue as your cities expand. This really enables like this garrison-based strategy of managing your stability. Garrisons do get some really nice infrastructure later in the game that continue to increase their stability output. So the Cyclopean Fortress can really help you manage that stability issue. I think particularly in the medieval era is when you can really start to feel it. And with the Mycenaeans, you're not going to feel it nearly as much. And it allows you to invest industry in other items instead of investing in stability. And that's important because the sooner you get outputs, the more effective they are over the course of the game. So if you take someone who can now build another maker's quarter, right, instead of having to build, say, a commons quarter, right, that maker's quarter is going to be much more effective at actually providing outputs for the player than the commons quarter is, because the commons quarter doesn't really produce that much in terms of useful outputs. So the Cyclopean Fortress is a great emblematic quarter. You're going to build it in every territory that you possibly can, because there's literally no drawback to building the Cyclopean Fortress. It is an excellent EQ. The emblematic unit, the Pama-Nyungan, is also very good. So this is a warrior replacement with a strength of 21. I think it's plus 2 combat strength over the normal warrior of 19. Standard movement, but very cheap to produce. So this 45 production doesn't include the reduction from the legacy trait. So it is a base of 45. It's actually 36 production once you include the legacy traits. So super cheap to produce, very easy to get Pama-Nyungan out. They do have a disadvantage, which is that they have a higher upkeep, but you shouldn't need as many of them in order to be combat effective. And in my mind, a stronger unit that costs a little bit more in terms of upkeep, but is actually just as easy to produce, is more valuable than having some lower upkeep units. And then the Pama-Nyungan, in addition to having a higher base strength, they get +4 combat strength when they're attacking during the first round of combat. This makes them very effective at breaking sieges, as well as in field battles. Like, you can win field battles on the first turn. And you can even do things with the Mycenaeans that you might not normally do with some other cultures, like having entire armies of just Pama-Nyungan. Because remember, archers are twice as expensive in terms of production, but early on in the ancient era in particular, the Pama-Nyungan can bring you victory just through their own like pure combat strength without the need for having ranged fire support. Very strong units you're going to be building these every single game, and quite a few of them as the Mycenaeans. So what are kind of the advantages and disadvantages here? I mean, the Mycenaeans have bonuses that are effective all game long through the legacy trait and the emblematic quarter. You're never going to regret having either of those. The industry cost reduction on units, Cyclopean Fortress exploiting industry, and particularly the stability on the Cyclopean Fortress is really what makes it so good and so effective as a quarter that is going to continue to benefit you throughout the entire game. Mycenaeans also have really high snowball potential because they get benefits to some of the most important outputs, including industry, as well as a really strong, cheap, emblematic unit that you can leverage to take out your opponents early, right? So this is where the Mycenaeans, including the Cyclopean Fortress being a really good emblematic quarter, but this is where where the Mycenaeans' snowball potential is much more effective than the Hittites, because they have early bonuses to actually enabling that snowball, right? By reducing the cost of the units that they build, as well as having a very early accessible emblematic unit. So this enables them to take war to their opponents very early and very easily. They do, however, struggle with population growth. This is lessened in impact a little bit by the fact that the Pama-Nyungan is such an effective unit, so you're not going to need as many of them, and therefore less population. But the Mycenaeans do have lower population growth than a lot of the other cultures in that era, so you are reliant on taking out an opponent fairly early in the game. You don't necessarily need to. The Mycenaeans can still be effective even if you don't go to early war, but that is when they are most effective. They also struggle with low influence generation. They have no bonuses to influence, and because they don't have a lot of population growth, they're not getting a lot of influence from population either. So again, if you want sort of higher population, you're going to be dependent on capturing other cities in order to generate the influence from population, and you're probably just not going to be claiming as many territories or like getting wonders in the same way that some other cultures are. So where am I putting the Mycenaeans? I am putting the Mycenaeans in A tier, simply because their ability to snowball, particularly against the AI on Humankind difficulty, is very, very consistent. And the Cyclopean Fortress is honestly one of the best districts in the ancient era. The Pama-Nyungan, very good unit, just like base combat strength on one of the basic units that you're going to be building, in addition to an industry cost reduction on that, in addition to extra combat strength on the first round of combat. Like, there's really nothing to dislike about the Mycenaeans. They are very effective in performing their role, and you pretty much can't go wrong picking them, so long as you have a neighbor that is like reasonably close to you. That's kind of the only contingency, but this is going to be most games. Most games you're going to be able to sustain a war against at least one reasonably close neighbor. So Mycenaeans, I think, give a lot of really great tools to like initiate that early warfare snowball, and they do it much more efficiently and consistently than the other kind of expansionist and militarist cultures of this era. So I'm giving them an A tier. So the Nubians are our first merchant affinity for the ancient era. So the passive ability allows for merchants to retrade resources that they've bought from other empires. So if I have bought sage from someone else, I can then turn around and sell that sage to another empire. So this is generally not that impactful early in the game, just because trade routes are so expensive, so you're not going to be selling that many resources right away. But it does get better later in the game, and at the start of the game, it might give you an extra trade route or two, but generally not super impactful. The active ability is kind of interesting, so you can use influence to either create a resource extractor or basically generate some money. So you can spend 25 influence, and if it is a resource extractor that is in someone's territory, and it can be anyone's territory, you pay that influence cost and develop that extractor. So obviously in your own territory, it can be useful. It is a slight discount compared to territory purchasing, or you can also use it to develop an extractor in one of your cities so that you don't have to build it with production. Now, if you target a resource that is in someone else's territory, then you can get some money by doing that, and you can target resources that have already extractors on them, and that also generates you some money. And then there's kind of an edge case as well, where you can generate some influence with independent people, not influence, like standing, whatever the word is. So you can get some benefits to your relationships with independent people if you target one of their extractors. So it's kind of versatile in terms of how you use it. It's definitely kind of a lower tier affinity, in my opinion, but the passive ability gets quite good in the late game when you have a lot of trade routes. For the ancient era, the main benefit is an influence discount in terms of purchasing the resource extractors. As far as what's specific to the Nubians, we have the legacy trait Golden Dreams. So this gives +5 money on luxury and strategic resources. At first glance, I think people undervalue just how much this can add up, and even the value of money in the early game. I do think money can be a little bit difficult to utilize effectively in the classical and medieval eras, because the cost to buy things out scales up faster than your ability to actually generate money during those eras. However, my experience is that during the ancient era, and in particular with the Nubians, your ability to generate money can actually outpace the buyout costs of items, and largely for the Nubians because of this legacy trait. Think about where you tend to settle in your games, right? The two things you are looking for are river, and you're looking for high concentrations of luxury and strategic resources because they are so important for you to be able to develop your empire over the course of the game. Nubians really, really shine when there is a high concentration of luxury resources that lets them take advantage of their legacy trait and lets them take advantage of their emblematic quarter, which we'll talk about in a minute. So Golden Dreams gives them great versatility because they're able to use all this money they're generating to buy out the things that they need. And because buyout is instant and it is a global resource, it allows them to allocate the benefits that they're getting across anywhere in their empire compared to someone that is focused on production, right? So the industry is specific to a certain city, so it can't help another city get online, for instance. So this legacy trait is really powerful, and I don't want anyone to underestimate it in the ancient era. So let's talk about the emblematic quarter, which I'm also a big fan of, the Moreau pyramids. So Moreau pyramids give +2 industry, +2 money, +3 money per adjacent maker's quarter. They do exploit industry and money, which makes them very effective when they're placed next to resource extractors because they'll get some money benefits there. And then they get +1 trader slots and count as a market and maker's quarter. So the Moreau pyramids are an excellent quarter. And the main reason for that is because they basically make maker's quarters better in the early game. So Moreau Pyramid is already a better maker's quarter because it gets you extra industry and money. There is a small exception here in that you don't get any worker slots for the Moreau Pyramid, so you have to keep that in mind. But it makes all the maker's quarters that you're building next to it better because you are generating money and getting the benefits of creating that maker's quarter, which you wanted to do anyway because maker's quarters are so powerful. So this Moreau Pyramid gives you the industry that you need in every single game, and it helps you generate your primary era stars and kind of tacks on to Golden Dreams in terms of the Nubians' ability to generate money. This makes the Nubians a really, really cash-heavy culture, and in my opinion are definitely the best for generating the merchant era stars in the ancient era, which is one of the hardest eras to actually get those stars. So Moreau Pyramids, really excellent. Next thing to talk about is the Tassadi archers, the emblematic unit. And this is another excellent feature of the Nubians. They have a base combat strength of 19, which I believe is +2 over the regular archer, which already makes them very, very good. The archer dominates the ancient era with indirect fire, right? You basically just use warriors as blockers, and you outnumber your opponents by having a ton of these ranged units that can fire over your own units. That is how you win battles in the ancient era, is through your archers and your use of terrain and using melee units as blockers. Having a straight combat strength bonus to archers is incredibly powerful. But they actually get a much bigger bonus than it appears at first glance. They have this ability that means they have no penalty from lacking line of sight. So when you don't have line of sight with an indirect fire unit, that normally imposes a -4 combat strength penalty. However, the Tassadi archers do not suffer from line of sight penalties. What this means is that Tassadi archers, in a ton of situations, have effectively a +6 combat strength bonus over regular archers. +6! That's insane. In my opinion, the Tassadi archers are the best unit of the ancient era, hands down. You can get them straight away. They are the most important unit of the era that they are replacing, and they are a straight upgrade over that unit. Tassadi archers, so good. I really, really like them. And if you're not building a ton of them as the Nubians, you're going wrong. It also makes the Nubians quite effective at warfare, especially early in the game before you get like a ton of chariots or horsemen or whatever. But the Tassadi archers remain effective into the classical era as well. You're still going to be using archers in the classical era, and just having a straight strength bonus makes them effective over both eras. So it makes the Nubians have a little bit more longevity in terms of their emblematic units compared to emblematic units from some other cultures. So let's talk a bit about the pros and cons here, right? In my opinion, like I just said, best ancient era emblematic units. They do have a very well-rounded emblematic quarter as well, providing both industry and money. There's no reason to not build it in any game. In every single territory you can possibly put it in. They're also very effective at merchant star generation, and that's important to note because merchant star generation in the ancient era is quite difficult. So Nubians being able to generate those stars does give them some advantages in terms of their fame generation long term. And, you know, it does help in the classical and medieval as well, and carrying on later in the game as you expand your access to more resources. They do, however, struggle with growth at times. I'm going to caveat this because it is possible that you have access to a bunch of luxury resources that give you growth, in which case that is a great scenario for the Nubians because you're not really sacrificing anything, and it makes the Nubians incredibly well-rounded. They can have good growth if you have access to things that, like, say, gives you +3 food on your administrative centers or whatever, and lets them develop at a very rapid pace. Most of the time, you're not going to have that, so they can struggle with growth, but there are some situations where that won't be as much of a struggle. I will say as well that their legacy traits in particular kind of has a lower mid to late game relevancy. +5 money on luxury and strategic resources does scale in the sense that you're going to have more of them as the game goes on, as you conquer more territory. However, this like flat +5 bonus money is going to become increasingly less relevant as like you stack the money figures up. So the scaling isn't quite as good, but it will help you through the first few eras. The main drawback to the Nubians, though, is that they are really highly luxury dependent. If you don't have a decent concentration of luxuries in your territory, the Nubians are not a good pick. This can happen with some amount of frequency. I've played plenty of games where you only have a couple luxuries nearby at the start of the game, and it kind of makes the Nubians a no-go, because the legacy traits in the ancient era is really a big component of what makes them so versatile. And if you're not able to leverage that legacy trait very effectively, then the Nubians really fall down in terms of rankings. So where do I put them overall? I have a really high opinion of the Nubians, and they're one of my favorite ancient era cultures, along with the Mycenaeans. but they're a lot less consistent, I think, than the Mycenaeans because of their dependence on access to resources, kind of in the same vein as the Assyrians being dependent on their access to horses. They're less dependent than the Assyrians in that respect, but also the Assyrians kind of have like a higher snowball cap than the Nubians do when they do have access to those resources. So in my mind, that kind of puts them in about the same range. I do think overall the Nubians are a very consistent culture, though. It's just that dependence on resource access bumps them down a tier compared to some of the other cultures that are really good in a wider array of situations. So we finally get to the Olmecs, who are our first aesthete affinity culture, and the passive ability enables cultural proximity to just always be maxed out. So what does it mean when cultural proximity is maxed out? There are a couple benefits and detriments. So benefits is that it's easier to sign agreements with other empires where you have max cultural proximity. There is also kind of a benefit / negative, which is that cultures that go to war with a culture that has maximum cultural proximity has some war supports penalties. So it makes it more difficult for the aesthetes to go to war by declaring war on people because they have bigger war support penalties, but it also makes it more difficult for other empires to go to war with the aesthetes. So whether this is an advantage or disadvantage kind of depends on the type of game that you're playing. This also has some kind of marginal effects with the independent peoples as well, so it makes it a little bit easier to handle them. Now, the active ability with the aesthetes is the one that we really need to talk about. So the active ability allows aesthetes to spend some money to target a territory, and it generates influence. And there are a few different factors that calculate, how much influence you actually generate, but the basic premise here is that it is very, very cheap to activate this ability, especially in the early game, and it generates a metric ton of influence. And that's kind of a problem for the balance of the game because of how important influence is at the start. So generally, you're going to be trading 40 gold for 180 influence, and 40 gold is super easy to get at the start of the game through picking up the various curiosities that are around the map and pillaging the sanctuaries and the layers and that kind of stuff. So when I played aesthetes, generally, I can have my second city by turn 13 to 15 pretty frequently. It's not very difficult to do. And the result of that is that you are effectively doubling your outputs over any other affinity. And this kind of makes this ability a little bit broken. So when we're talking about the Olmecs, remember we're also talking about them within the context of this particular affinity. In later eras, this is not particularly important. Also important to note that the active ability here does not contribute to your aesthete star generation, so it's kind of cataloged separately. You still have to generate those stars as normal. But this thing allows you to put down a ton of outposts, get your city, your second city online pretty much immediately, and it makes you basically double as effective as other cultures at the very start of the game. So the legacy trait here, Natural Harmony, gives you +3 influence on territory. So Olmecs have a crazy good territory snowball. So this used to be nerfed a long time ago. It went from the beta where it was really good, and then the release was really bad, and now it's back to being pretty damn good again with the +3 influence on territory. Every single territory that you own as the Olmecs is going to generate you more influence. So this allows you to just keep putting down more and more and more and more and more outposts. And particularly within the context of the aesthete affinity bonus, the Olmecs can go crazy with their outpost placement and their influence generation. It makes them very consistent at being able to generate the aesthete stars in the early game, which I will note is quite difficult to do. I find on average they are the hardest stars to generate. And it gives you a ton of options in terms of getting additional cities online, getting access to more luxury resources, and just generally beating out the AI in terms of being able to place down those important outposts at important locations. So Natural Harmony is a really great legacy trait. It does fall off a little bit at the end of the game. You'll get a decent amount of influence from it. It's just that influence isn't as important later in the game. The other kind of benefit from this as well is that it gives the Olmecs specifically, and kind of other aesthetes more generally because of their affinity, but specifically the Olmecs related to their legacy trait, it gives them the ability to go for a really early wonder. You'll often have your first choice of wonder as the Olmecs, and you don't always have the industry to support building it right away, but you can claim whatever wonder you want that you feel like is going to generate you the most benefits throughout the course of the game. And I would recommend doing that. It is a good use of influence. And when you're picking the Olmecs or picking some of the other cultures we'll talk about later, it's a great way to leverage some of that extra influence for some longer term benefits aside from just claiming additional territory. The emblematic quarter is the Olmec head, and this is a farmer's quarter, emblematic quarter. So it's a slightly more efficient farmer's quarter that gives you +3 food, +1 influence, and gives you influence per adjacent farmer's quarter. And it does the usual farmer's quarter things of exploiting food and giving you a farmer slot. So the outputs are fine. This is a below average quarter, I would say. A +3 food is welcome for sure, and +1 influence is welcome. You're not going to be generating a ton of influence from this compared to the legacy trait in particular. I think perhaps the developers might overvalue the +1 influence per adjacent farmer quarter. You're just not going to be building that many farmers' quarters in the earlier eras. They're not very efficient quarters to build. So you'll build like these Olmec heads and then just switch over to building maker's quarters most of the time. So you'll get a little bit of extra influence from this later in the game. But for the most part, you can just think of the Olmec heads as giving you +3 food and +1 influence. So they're fine. It's like a buff to a quarter that you might build. It does make it worth building. But compared to some of the other benefits the Olmecs get, this is kind of lower on the list. It's just an okay quarter. The emblematic unit is the javelin throwers. So javelin throwers are interesting. They have a base combat strength of 21, which is +4 over an archer. They have 2 range, and they are a direct fire unit. So this means, right, they can fire like between units, and they need direct line of sight, right? So they can fire between units, they can like fire down from terrain, but like they can't fire over a forest, for instance, or over units. So this constrains their ability to operate on the battlefield because you need to be really careful with their positioning. They do get +6 combat strength on forest tiles, which are relatively common, and like most ranged units, they get -8 combat strength when defending against melee attacks. So the main constraint on these javelin throwers is that they're direct fire. They can be useful in some situations, especially if you are playing an offensive or defensive game where you know the territory you'll be fighting in has a lot of forest. But generally, I prefer to have archers over javelin throwers just because archers have more range and indirect fire. You can kind of split the difference a bit, right, and have javelin throwers kind of as your second line so that they can shoot through the gaps, and then the archers as your third line for indirect fire. But, it just depends. It used to be that the javelin throwers replaced the archers, which is no longer the case. You can build both javelin throwers and archers, so that makes the Olmecs a little bit better overall because archers are so critical to ancient era combat. So that gives you a little bit more versatility in terms of constructing your armies and what you feel is going to be relevant for any given situation. So what are the benefits of the Olmecs? So the Olmecs are benefiting a lot from the aesthete affinity. They have really high influence generation because of their legacy trait and because of the active ability of the aesthetes. So this gives them a really big territory snowball. So as I said, like turn 15, you can have your second city. You can expand your territory super quickly, start claiming all those luxuries, start claiming all the strategic resources. You can even like get your third city online, paying influence. You can get access to wonders, whatever it is you feel is going to be most beneficial to your game. So it gives you a ton of versatility in the early game in terms of setting you up for future success. However, the Olmecs do have a below average emblematic quarter and emblematic unit. I would also say that their bonuses are less relevant mid to late game. Natural harmony is still nice to have, but like you're barely going to remember you ever built Olmec heads, and the javelin throwers, I mean, they're fine, they're okay. You might use them sometimes, but you're often just going to choose to build archers instead. I'll also add that the javelin throwers have a pretty bad upgrade path. So unless you choose like the Maya in the next era, they don't have anything to upgrade into. So they do have a higher base combat strength, so they can still be marginally useful in the next era. It's just, lack of direct fire of indirect fire can hold them back a little bit. So javelin throwers are okay. Olmec head is okay. Natural harmony, really, really good in the ancient era, and aesthete is amazing in the ancient era. So this might surprise you, or maybe not, depending on how closely you follow the game, but I did place the Olmecs in the S tier. And this is almost exclusively because of the aesthete ability and their legacy traits. Because getting that territory snowball going that early is so insanely powerful. When you have your second city online on turn 15, right, you are doubling your outputs basically compared to a lot of the other civilizations that are in the game. And that's going to make you so much more effective. It's going to make you reach your breakpoints much more easily. It's going to allow you to generate your era stars. It's going to allow you to have a greater war effort if you're going to go to war, right? It allows you to do everything that you already want to do, but significantly better and significantly faster than a lot of the other cultures can come online. So although their bonuses don't scale quite as well as some of the other cultures do, how quickly they can become like a more centralized, developed empire just gives them such a big advantage over any of the other cultures that are available in the ancient era. And that's the reason why they are S tier. Like that ability to get that second city and to get all those territories and set yourself up for the rest of the game is so important. So S tier for the Olmecs. I never thought I'd be here, honestly, but here we are. This brings us to our second aesthete of the ancient era, the Pama-Nyungan. So again, another aesthete, and I've already talked a little bit about how important the active ability is for the aesthetes in the ancient era, so I'll just move over that and go straight into the legacy trait, which is storied lands. So this is similar a little bit to Olmecs. So the Pama-Nyungan get +5 influence on landmark parts and +5 influence on natural wonder. So hopefully you all know what the natural wonders are already, and I don't have to explain that one any further. The landmark parts are like the named terrain features on the map. So these can be like forests, rivers. I think there are some deserts. So for every part of those named features, you get +5 influence from that. So the Pama-Nyungan can actually get a really, really big influence boost at the start of the game if you're settling in the correct territories, which can really help snowball into more territories. Overall, and over the long term, generally the Olmecs are going to get more influence out of their legacy trait than the Pama-Nyungan are. However, there are some cases in which case this particular culture is going to exceed the Olmecs in like the short to medium term in their ability to generate influence, depending on just how many landmark parts they have in their territory. So similar in effect, but more specific in its applicability. The emblematic quarter is fish traps, and I am a huge fan of fish traps. So fish traps give you +2 food, and they give you +2 food per adjacent river. They also give you +1 farmer slot. It counts as a farmer's quarter. And the very important part of fish traps, they don't require a connection to a city, and they have to be built on a river. And then they act as an anchor as well. So once you build the fish traps, you can build additional districts off of them. So this makes the Pama-Nyungan very river dependent because your fish traps have to have a river. And ideally, you're going to be choosing this culture when you have a lot of rivers. Pama-Nyungan benefit a ton from having a lot of rivers because of how many outputs, specifically food, that you can generate from the fish traps. So if you don't have a lot of river, Pama-Nyungan is not the best choice. But it does give them a lot of versatility when they do have that option. So you can build off additional agriculture quarters or makers quarters or whatever and give you access to other parts of the territory that you might not have from your city or your administrative center. So fish traps really give the Pama-Nyungan a distinct advantage over the Olmecs in terms of growth when the fish traps are applicable. So the Olmecs have slight benefits to growth through their Olmec heads and a more consistent legacy trait. However, the Pama-Nyungan, with their emblematic quarter, have really, really high potential, I would say above the Olmecs, in the cases where their legacy trait and their emblematic quarter align, right? When you're getting the benefits from the legacy trait and you're getting the benefits from the emblematic quarter, they exceed the value that the Olmecs are going to be able to provide even at their best. Because the Olmecs' best is basically the same regardless of the situation that you're in, whereas the Pama-Nyungan get like better benefits but in more specific circumstances. So let's talk a little bit about the unit, which is the boomerang throwers. Boomerang throwers are 18 combat strength, 2 range, and they're another direct fire unit. The big thing with them, I mean, they ignore movement penalties from forests, which is kind of nice, and they regenerate health when outside of their own territory. I've already talked about health regeneration with the healers and the Caralans, but basically, in case you haven't watched that particular segment, health regeneration being enabled is just not that valuable in the ancient era specifically, I think. Most of the combat you're going to be partaking in, so will be in your territory where you're defending and you'll get health regen anyway. You'll be in neutral territory where if you really need to, you can put down an outpost, especially as an aesthete where you're going to have the influence to do it and allow for regeneration in your territory. Or you're going to be attacking a city where your units will begin to regenerate as soon as you take the city because it's now considered your territory. So the boomerang throwers in particular are a little bit weird because they will regenerate health, but the rest of the army wouldn't. So I've tried to use the boomerang throwers, but I don't really know what their use case is supposed to be because the units that are kind of blocking for them are going to deteriorate through combat, even if they're able to heal. So you need to find a way to heal your blocker units anyway. And you could try to do like a full army of boomerang throwers, but then they have this -8 combat strength penalty when defending against melee attacks. So what the purpose of the boomerang throwers is a bit of a mystery to me. It's not a particularly well-designed unit, whereas like the javelin thrower, you can have some use cases for it, even if it's not the best. There are some situations in which it's valuable. The boomerang throwers, I just don't really see a use case for. They're just not good enough to ever really consider building. So that being said, Pama-Nyungan, excellent territory snowball. They have good population growth. They're not quite as good as like the Harappans, but they are good pop growth and an aesthete, right? And that is a really important combination because influence and population are like the two most important things in the ancient era. Those are what set you up for the rest of the game and enable you to be effective throughout the ancient era, is claiming territories and generating your outputs through your populations until you get to the point where districts become more important than pop. Obviously, they have good influence generation, and just like ancient aesthetes in general, are overpowered. They are river dependent, similar to the Harappans. You're going to have rivers in most games. I think where the Pama-Nyungan are a little bit differentiated is that Harappans get more broad-based food outputs, whereas the fish traps need like a specific shape of river in order to get a really good benefit from them. But I do find in most games you can get reasonable numbers of fish traps and be relatively effective. The other big disadvantage to the Pama-Nyungan is that they have a pretty bad emblematic units. Boomerang throwers are just not good. But, it's not like they replace archers. You still have access to all the normal units, and thanks to your relatively good pop growth, you can sustain a decent-sized military with the Pama-Nyungan. So it's not like that big of a deal, especially considering that they have a lot of other advantages. It's fine that the emblematic unit isn't that good. But obviously it is a disadvantage to choosing them. So overall, just like the Olmecs, specifically because of the aesthete ability and the ability to get a second city so early in the game, generate a ton of influence, claim territories, claim the strategic and luxury resources, get access to the wonders that you want. Pama-Nyungan are another S-tier culture. They're very, very strong, and I would argue in the correct circumstance, they are the strongest of the ancients era cultures. They exceed the max of the Olmecs when they're placed in a situation where they have access to landmarks or wonders, natural wonders that is, as well as several rivers across multiple territories. Excellent culture. Highly recommend playing them if you haven't played them or you haven't played them very much. And in particular, and this goes for the Olmecs as well, make sure you are clicking that active ability as soon as you can and getting your second city as soon as you can. We have the Phoenicians now as the second merchant affinity culture. I've covered the merchant affinity already with the Nubians, so you can go take a look at that if you want. But the short version of the merchants in the ancient era is that the merchant affinity is not super impactful. So let's move on to the legacy trait, which is trading pioneers. So the Phoenicians get +2 money per trader. They also get +1 combat strength and movement on naval units and on naval transports. So some marginal benefits to naval units early in the game. It's not super valuable. You're not going to be doing a lot of naval combat against the AI typically, so that is of questionable utility. However, the +2 money per trader can actually be kind of nice. The traders aren't particularly efficient worker slots at the start of the game, and this does make them a little bit better. And particularly near the end of the era, once the Phoenicians have kind of come online and they can allocate some workers to traders, this is what enables them to really catch up on the merchant stars, or at least part of it. And it does scale decently well throughout the game as you continue to get access to more of the merchant slots through emblematic quarters and other effects. So the +2 money per trader is not like super great right away, but once you get your growth going, which the Phoenicians do have the capacity to do, then it becomes a lot more impactful. So it's hard to talk about it, right, without the context of the emblematic quarter, which is the Haven. So the Haven is a harbor quarter, and it gives you +2 money per adjacent coastal water and lake, and it exploits all the fins that are on the water, just like a regular harbor, right? So it does count as a farmers and a market quarter, so it gives you adjacency accordingly, gives you 1 trader and 1 farmer slot, and it benefits from all the different harbor effects. So the Haven is really interesting. The harbors are really effective overall in terms of getting growth because they have a 2-tile range. So when you have your landmass configured in such a way that the harbor can work a whole bunch of tiles, it is often more effective than building a farmer's quarter. So the Haven, in that respect, just being an upgraded harbor makes it quite strong. And it combines really well with the first tier religious tenets that gives you extra food on water tiles. So the Haven gives Phoenicians really good early growth since you're prioritizing that, and gives you some money for building something that's already nice to build. The other kind of thing or effects that you need to know about the Haven is that you can influence purchase it, and that is a very important enabler for the Phoenicians. Generally, the strategy with the Phoenicians is that you rush to get the Haven as soon as possible, you get a bunch of territories online and influence purchase the Haven, and then attach them to your territory. Where the Phoenicians run into trouble, though, revolves around the Haven, because the Haven requires a certain technology before you can place them. And it's kind of in like the second tier of ancient era technologies. So there's a tech you have to research, and then you can research the tech that enables the Haven, and it's relatively expensive early in the game. But if you're trying to prioritize, maximal efficiency with the Phoenicians, then you are going to want to rush that tech. What this means for the Phoenicians is that they have a really, really, really painfully slow start. They don't have any real advantages to getting their civilization up and running until they have the Haven unlocked. And they don't have any strong, growth of pops. They don't have industry bonuses, anything like that. So, they are super dependent on getting this Haven unlocked. And what this means sort of in the midterm, the short to midterm of the ancient era, is that the Phoenicians are really vulnerable to early aggression from neighbors, because the techs that you need at the start of the game aren't going to give you access to all the units that you need, and you don't have the population growth or the industry to support a strong military. So the Phoenicians are a difficult choice to make when you have nearby neighbors, because it's going to leave you vulnerable, and it takes a long time for the Phoenicians to come online because of the tech requirement for the Haven and the amount of influence that you need in order to purchase it on neighboring territories. Kind of the other component to consider as well is that the Haven makes the Phoenicians very terrain dependent. You can get a lot of bad generation when it comes to water tiles. It's a little inconsistent, in my opinion. Like, sometimes you'll have like just little tiny segments of water that are actually workable because it's only the shallow water that you can work with harbors and not the deep water. And other times you'll have like massive expanses of workable terrain. So the Phoenicians like not only depend on not having a close neighbor because that would make them very vulnerable, but also like having several territories that are nearby that are conducive to harbors. And that doesn't always work out. So the emblematic unit for the Phoenicians is the Bireme. It's a naval transport unit, and it is damaged by consecutive turns in deep water. And this is an advantage over regular units for this era because the normal naval transport is destroyed after one turn in deep water. So this allows the Phoenicians to basically go exploring, right? They can get across to islands. Sometimes, depending on the generation, they can discover a new continent, which allows them to perhaps trade for resources or get some agreements with some other cultures that other players in the game are not going to have access to. So it does have some edge cases where it's useful, but kind of the benefits that you get from the Bireme aren't particularly good. And in general, in the ancient era, the best thing for an emblematic unit is to be a combat unit, like a land-based combat unit. A lot of the ancient era is about setting yourself up and defending yourself from neighboring empires and eventually taking territory from them to let you get going later in the game by having more cities, right? Or at the very least, defending yourself so you don't lose your own cities. So Bireme, some marginal benefits kind of around the exterior, but a not particularly impactful unit. So Phoenicians overall, they have really high mid to late game growth potential because of the Haven, and you can combine this with other harbors as you go, right? So you have like the Carthaginians, you have the Swahili, all that kind of stuff. And if you can pick up that religious trait that gives you that extra food on water, the Phoenicians go crazy with growth late in the game. So it really enables a strong late game. They can also like get trade options that are not available to other cultures, like I mentioned with the Bireme, if you manage to explore, say, another continent or something like that, and you can get access to like additional luxuries that might help you boost your empire or whatever. Generally not super relevant in the ancient era, but it will enable some extra possibilities as you get later into the game, particularly in the classic and medieval, before some of the other neighboring empires on your continent have been able to explore the other continents. Main disadvantages. Very slow start, as I talked about before, particularly revolving around the issues with the Haven. Once it's online, the Phoenicians will accelerate very quickly, but it can take a while to get there. So the Phoenicians benefit a lot from having a lot of scouts when you enter the Ancients, and you can disband the scouts, place them onto industry and science so that you can actually produce things in a reasonable amount of time, and so that you research the technology for Haven in a recent amount of time so you can accelerate your growth. They're also very coast dependent, which means they're like map generation dependent. So it can be a little bit tricky to determine when is the right time to pick the Phoenicians. Because, say, even though you might have one territory that is really conducive to a haven, all the surrounding territories might totally suck. So you do want to have a decent amount of information about what the coastal terrain looks like before you pick the Phoenicians. They do struggle a lot with production. They make up for it a little bit with their growth later, as well as with the money that they can generate from their legacy trait and from the Haven. But particularly like the first 25 to 30 turns of the game, they have very low production and a very poor early military, right? Because of the tech path that they have to take and because they need to invest that production in their first Haven, which is an expensive quarter to build, and invest that production in like quarters that are going to boost them rather than being able to invest in early military. So the Phoenicians are a very vulnerable culture at the start of the game, but given the opportunity to grow and kind of be isolated a little bit from other cultures for a while, they also have really good late growth potential. So I have placed the Phoenicians in C tier, and this is an upgrade from where I placed them before. I have grown to appreciate them a little bit more, and just generally pops a little bit more, especially at the start of the game. So I do value the Phoenicians more than I did. And I also think I've just gotten some better terrain generation for them recently than I had in the past. And that is important. But I do think that their trade-off that they're making is not a trade-off that is necessary for a lot of the other cultures, while also those other cultures are just as effective at the start of the game and scale really well into the late game, right? So thinking about like the Harappans, for instance, you still get the insane growth without having to make the same sacrifices as the Phoenicians. So they can be good. They can be good. Like, I will not deny that. It's just that the situations in which they're good are a lot more limited than the cultures that are in the tiers above them. Next, we have the Sumerians, who are our first and only diplomat culture for the era. Just like every era, there's only one diplomat culture. So the passive ability here allows them to collect leverage with all unit types. So usually there are leverages kind of sitting around on the map. You'll know the icon if you put the game already, and they're generated from grievances. So when a grievance is generated, there's a leverage that is dropped on the map somewhere, and you can go pick them up. And normally you need diplomats to get them. However, when you play a diplomat affinity, any unit can pick up leverage. This is actually a pretty decent passive ability here, especially in the ancient era, because the tech that unlocks envoys is a pretty low priority technology. So by picking the diplomat affinity, it actually allows the Sumerians to just completely ignore that tech if they so choose, and just allow their like scouts and military units to deal with the leverage collection. And this is kind of important because the diplomat star is probably the hardest to generate on larger map sizes, just because of how the scaling is. So being able to grab these extra leverages early is going to give you a pretty major advantage in terms of generating the diplomat stars. They also get +1 agent cap as a diplomat, but that's not going to have any relevancy in the ancient era, and probably not in any era you're playing, really. So you can kind of ignore that part. Their active ability basically lets them create a demilitarized zone, and it generates leverage from enemy units that are in the target territory. So just a way to supplement your leverage generation. It has some additional effects, like if it's a neutral empire that's like trespassing on a territory, it can kick them out and that kind of stuff. But the main reason you're going to use it is going to be for that leverage generation. So those are the two effects that you get from the diplomat affinity. So specific to the Sumerians, they have the legacy trait learned addition, so they have a reduced attached territory cost per remaining city cap count. So at the start of the game, you have a city cap of 2. You're always going to have at least one city for the most part. So when you have your first city and no other cities, you'll have a 10% reduced attached territory cost. So you'll save, on your first territory, 3 influence. On your second territory, you'll save more than that, obviously. So it scales up the more territories you need to attach to your city. It's not amazing. You also have a reduced cost of signing treaties with independent peoples. I've found recently in particular that not that many independent people tend to generate. You'll usually get a few, and it's not that expensive to sign treaties with them in the first place. So, I don't know. Legacy trait on the Sumerians is not great, in my opinion. The impact of both of these elements is pretty low. Like, even the reduced attached territory cost later in the game, like, influence is just not that important late in the game. It's important in the early game, but like 10% isn't enough, especially for like the early territory attach costs. And frankly, you want as many cities as you can get. So there are a lot of situations where you're not going to be getting any benefits from that. So I don't value this legacy trait very much. I think it's a pretty bad legacy trait. The Ediba is their emblematic quarter. So this one's an interesting one. So you get +5 leverage against all known empires when you build it. It also has a flat +2 science. You get +6 science per adjacent main plaza and administrative center, and you get +1 science per adjacent farmer quarter. It also counts as a research quarter. So ideally, you end up in a situation where you have like an admin center and a main city center, like a tile away from each other, and the Ediba can straddle both. That usually won't be the case, but if you can set it up like that, it might be worth it. The real key here is the +5 leverage against all known empires when built. it is kind of a weird one because it creates a bit of a perverse incentive for the Ediba. The science is more valuable the earlier that you get it, since this science doesn't really scale in the same way as some other science options in the ancient era. It does benefit from research quarter infrastructure, but the +5 leverage against all known empires when built means that you kind of want to delay this until you've met all possible empires in order to maximize the leverage gain. But then you're sacrificing a relatively strong science buff in order to do it. So you kind of have to make a decision about whether the science or the leverage is more important to you. The leverage is handy. I will say the leverage is probably the least important resource in the game, especially in the ancient era. It doesn't have a very dramatic impact on your actual ability to win the game. It is good to generate those stars, and the Sumerians are able to generate the diplomat stars more effectively than the other cultures. But the diplomat era star, like if you're looking across, a timeline, the diplomat era star is going to be the one that is least associated with your ability to win the game. Whereas like expansionist stars, super important. The growth stars are super important. The builder stars are super important. The leverage stars are like, they kind of supplement your ability to interact with other empires in a certain way, but like they're not reflective at all of your ability to scale throughout the game or to win the game at the end. They just are really a boost to your ultimate star count. So it is nice to be able to get them, but it's not like super important to make leverage compared to any of the other outputs. It is a decent amount of science, so in that respect, it is kind of nice to get the Ediba. But like the overall effects, I would honestly rather have the Babylonians emblematic quarter, which gets less base science, but the scaling on it is way, way better. Finally, the emblematic unit is the Aga-Ush. So this is a spearmen unit. So it has a base combat strength of 20, which is a little bit above a normal spearman, the normal +8 CS against mounted units. And it gets +1 CS for each Aga-Ush in the same army. So it's a little bit like a Greek hoplite in that respect. So if you have 4 of these in an army, each of them is going to have a strength of 24. So it's a decent unit. It's definitely not bad, and you can do some early conquest with it for sure. So it is worth building, and in some cases, you might even want to try to rush this tech as the Sumerians if you want to go for a bit of a rush. Kind of counter to what the diplomats normally do, but, it's worth it if you're using this unit. I think with 24 base combat strength, you can break cities pretty easily. There is you have to make a bit of a change to how you might normally run with your armies. So you might need to keep like a full army of Aga-Ush and a full army of archers, because you still will want fire support. So do bear that in mind when you're building them. But they can make a pretty strong front line until the classical era, when you'll need to start replacing them with other units. So overall, sort of benefits for the Sumerians. They're the only culture that have benefits to leverage generation, and particularly the passive ability of collecting leverage with all unit types is something that's very unique and impactful in the ancient era in a way it isn't in later eras. They also have decent science generation with the Ediba, assuming you're okay with building that before you've met every possible culture. So you kind of have to make that trade-off sometimes. Even though the Sumerians are the diplomats and they do have sort of special abilities towards generating the leverage, diplomacy stars in general are just too difficult to generate, especially on larger map sizes. And even with the Sumerians, it can be a bit of a struggle to get the diplomacy stars throughout the game. They also have a really slow start. They don't have any bonuses to growth. They don't have any bonuses to industry. So you're completely reliant on whatever terrain you have for your growth in industry. And it can take a while to come online. There also are no like mid to late game bonuses, right? Like the emblematic quarter of the Ediba basically just becomes a research quarter with a marginal bonus to science. The learned addition trait is really not that impactful because you're basically always at your city cap if you're playing the game efficiently. The Aga-Ush is relevant to the ancient era, but will fall down in the classical era as it gets replaced with better melee units with higher base combat strength. So the mid to late game bonuses just aren't there. And then, like I mentioned, the awkward kind of emblematic quarter in the Edaba, because you have that trade-off that you want to make with, getting the maximum amount of leverage so you can get your diplomat stars versus wanting to get the science as early as possible so you can progress down the tech tree. So where do I put Sumerians overall? I put them in the D tier. They do have some advantages with the diplomat stars. There's no denying it, right? Like, your ability to generate diplomat stars is unrivaled by the Sumerians, right? Like, they are the best at it unequivocally. However, those stars are by far the least important of all the stars that you can generate, and the Sumerians just don't give you anything that you need in order to scale up your civilization into the later game. There's some science and there's some leverage. Like, base science is all right. Leverage is like, you don't need it as a player. The most important part is the fame that you get from it. And yes, it enables you to get some more fame potentially than some of the other cultures by even generating those stars to begin with. But like, whether or not you have leverage basically has no impact on your ability to actually win the game. So the Sumerians, like, yes, they do enable something that some of the other cultures can't really do very effectively. It's just that the thing that they do is not that important. So that's why I'm putting them in D tier. Finally, we have Zhou. And the Zhou are an aesthete affinity, and we've already covered the aesthetes starting with the Olmecs. So if you want a little bit more detail about them, feel free to hop back on the video to the Olmecs to cover the aesthetes. But the gist of it is that the aesthete's active ability is super overpowered in the ancient era, gives you a whole bunch of influence for a relatively low sum of money that really propels your game by enabling you to get a bunch of territories in a really early second city. So let's talk about the Zhou's legacy trait, which is harmonious thought. So +2 stability on all quarters. So this perhaps does not seem like a super impactful legacy trait to someone who doesn't have a lot of experience with the game. To put this in perspective, if you have harmonious thought, for every 10 quarters that another culture can support with their stability, the Zhou can support 12.5 quarters. So they can support 25% more quarters than another culture on the same amount of stability generating outputs. So what this means for the Zhou is that while other cultures are wasting their industry and their time building things like commons quarters or garrisons, the Zhou are building their makers quarters and their research quarters and their market quarters still at a lower stability cost. So this allows them to get those outputs earlier. It allows them to sustain high stability in their cities, which is really important in the ancient era because high stability lets your population generate extra influence per population. So remember, 90 plus stability gives you +2 influence per pop, and 30 to 90 stability gives you +1 influence per pop. So the Zhou don't have any direct benefits to influence output. The Confucian school gets you a little bit, but the +2 stability on quarters also enables you to keep up your influence from population for a pretty decent amount of time. So harmonious thought is actually a really impactful ability, and particularly as you get into later eras and before you get like manufactories and some of the techs in the industrial era that give you stability per pop and that sort of thing, the harmonious thought will have a really big impact on your ability to maintain stability into the mid game. So I really like harmonious thought as a legacy trait. It isn't like the best legacy trait to have right off the bat, but it does scale really well later into the game. Their emblematic quarter is the Confucian school. So you get +1 science, +5 science per adjacent mountain, you get a little bit of stability. The effects, you get +1 researcher slot, and it counts as a research quarter. So the Confucian school is very terrain dependent, right? The +5 science per adjacent mountain is the thing that should key you in here, right? Because otherwise you're basically just getting some extra stability. Obviously, the output ends up as +10 stability with the Confucian school once you layer on the legacy trait. So it's kind of like building a garrison with one upgrade. So the Confucian school, though, the +5 science per adjacent mountain makes it terrain dependent, like I said. So it kind of limits the effectiveness of the Zhou in a lot of ways to starts where you have a sufficient number of mountains to actually make it worth picking them. Because otherwise, kind of the thing that you're getting from the Zhou is just the +2 stability on quarters and the aesthete affinity, which could potentially be worth it in some situations. But, if the Olmec or Pama-Nyungan are still available, or potentially some other cultures, it might not be worth it just for those two abilities. Whereas if you have several territories where there's at least a couple mountains that you can get access to, the Confucian school gives you a really nice bonus to your early game science outputs, as well as providing you with that extra stability that you need to maintain high stability so you can keep generating influence from your population. Finally, we have the emblematic unit, which is the Zansha. I'm not sure how to pronounce this one. So pretty high combat strength unit at 23. It is a melee chariot. Expensive production, 180, 8 horses and 5 copper, so high resource requirements. And it has the typical charge, so that +3 CS when attacking enemies that aren't adjacent. The other effect here is that you get +3 CS when you have high stability, and this is like empire-wide stability. So obviously a lot easier to maintain with the Zhou, given the legacy trait Harmonious Thought, as well as the Confucian school EQ. So this can be a pretty high combat strength chariot, and it is effective when you can get it. The main problem with it is that it's on a late and relatively low priority technology. So even with the Zhou, with this unit, you can prioritize it, but there's not a lot of need to, especially since it can't attack over walls, just like any mounted unit. So impactful sometimes, like if you can rush it, you might be able to do like a timing play, and the Zhou are more capable of getting it because of the Confucian school that gives them that extra science. So you could go for like a timing push with these things, but it's not really necessary, and you'll generally find that that tech is just not priority over a lot of the other techs. So it's an okay unit, it's just not going to get prioritized in most of the games that you play with them. So just general benefits here. Zhou have a good territory snowball. It's not as good as the Olmecs or the Pama-Nyungan or maybe even the Harappans, but just because of the aesthete affinity with that active ability, as well as your ability to keep high stability to generate influence from population, you can get a pretty decent number of territories that come under your control fairly early in the game. And of course, given that they're the aesthetes, you can get that second city super early. And I've already talked about the really good benefits of that. They do have excellent stability bonuses. And that's something that's pretty unique to them. It does combine really nicely with that +2 stability from Rivers Pantheon, or first tier of like religious tenets that you can get, as well as, honestly, the extra influence from mountains, because usually you're picking the Zhou if you are in mountainous terrain. So they do have some pretty good options for that first tier, if they so choose, that aren't always the best for other cultures. They also have good science bonuses with the Confucian school. It's just that the science bonuses are very dependent on terrain. Now, the Zhou do have high EQ terrain dependence, like I've already talked about. Their emblematic unit is late and pretty expensive, and they do have some difficulty generating the main era stars. And this is primarily because the aesthete active ability doesn't count towards the aesthete star generation. They have some benefits towards it because of their high stability, but they don't have any benefits to growth, right? So the Zhou are going to have a little bit more difficulty getting those aesthete stars when compared to, say, the Olmecs or the Pama-Nyungan. So overall, where am I placing the Zhou? I'm placing them in A tier, which is an upgrade from where I had them before, and this is primarily because of how effective the aesthete active ability is now. They're not as good as the Olmecs or Pama-Nyungan in my experience. Those two cultures enable a much better territory snowball, and they have better growth in general, which is important in the early game. The Zhou are kind of a longer term play, and they're a little bit more terrain dependent because of the Confucian school. So they can still be really excellent, and there are times where they might even be a better pick than the two cultures that are in S tier or the cultures that are in A tier. It's just that the times that they are a better pick are a lot more constrained than some of the other cultures. So still very effective, but because of the terrain dependence, you're not going to pick them as often as you pick a lot of the other cultures in similar tiers. So this is the final tier list. So it's a bit of an uneven distribution, a non-normal distribution, which I do think is okay. I do think there are pretty big power differentials between the tiers in the ancient era in ways that there aren't necessarily in some of the other eras, so I don't expect a normal kind of distribution here. It is somewhat close to a normal distribution, but just bearing in mind that like the S and the A tier cultures in particular are like a league better than the cultures below them. They're not particularly close, and there's also a pretty big gap between the B and the C tier cultures. Like the C and the D tier are fairly bad in comparison, and it's not that you can't make them work or that they can't be good in their own rights. It's just like the B and above in particular are so substantially better that it kind of skews the average versus the median in this particular group of cultures in this particular era. So really appreciate you all being here today. Obviously, making this stuff takes a while, so I appreciate your patience, and I do appreciate you watching this. And if you have any questions about why I've ranked things the way that I've done, or you have any comments about it, or you want to talk about some of the greater nuances of these cultures, happy to talk about them. Leave a comment below. And I'll see you next time when I'm either conquering the world again, doing some kind of challenge, putting up my next tier list for the classical era, which is in the works. It'll take a while. Like I said, obviously this takes a while to produce, but it's coming, I promise. So cheers, y'all. See you soon.